Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's Tech Talk on security in the cloud. My name is Gerard Heiner, and I am the Chief Business Officer here at Webair. I'll be your host for today's Tech Talk, and today we have an expert panelist from Webair, Cipher, and Jovia. Our panelists have decades of experience in the IT field, and each panelist has a very unique background within the industry. So before we dive in, I just want to take a moment so everyone can introduce themselves. Sagi, why don't you start it off?
Sure. My name is Sagi Brody. I'm the CTO at Webair. Been here for about 20 years now, a long time. And if you don't know Webair, we are a managed cloud provider, which means that we manage cloud-based infrastructure, typically hybrid cloud for our customers, and provide services such as hosted private cloud, co-location, networking services, backups, disaster recovery, and sort of everything in between.
Excellent, thank you, Sagi. Scott, why don't you introduce yourself and Cipher?
Sure, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Scott Croskey here. I'm the Global Chief Information Security Officer for Cipher. Cipher is a managed security service provider. So we engage with many clients and customers to be able to manage a wide array of different security technology stacks inside customer environments. We also project-based delivery of penetration testing, red teaming services, as well as the delivery of cyber intelligence services. So it's a pleasure to be with everybody here today.
Excellent, thank you, and welcome. And last but not least, we have Dr. Daniel Ford, who is the CIO at Jovia Financial Credit Union. Dan, can you take a moment to introduce yourself and Jovia?
Absolutely. So I've been with Jovia now for about 16 months. We're headquartered here in Westbury, New York, out on Long Island. We tend to serve, our membership is in Long Island, which is Nassau and Suffolk County. Prior to joining Jovia, I've got about 4 years of experience in the financial services, but predominantly most of my experience has been doing some type of government contracting or creating products for worldwide public sector. I have a Doctor of Science in Cybersecurity, and I recently finished my MBA from the University of Michigan.
Excellent, thank you for the introduction. So now that we've met our speakers, let's jump right in and tackle some of the most important topics in business and technology today. That's cloud security. So if you have any questions throughout this Tech Talk, please feel free to drop them in the question box, and we'll get to as many as we can in the Q&A section, that portion at the end of this webinar. So we'll be recording the Tech Talk as well. So anyone who wants to re-see it again, we'll be sending that information out to you as soon as it's available. So the first question I'm going to address to both Sagi and Scott, if you can answer in turn. Sagi and Scott, can you tell us what some of the most common misconceptions people have regarding security and the cloud today?
Yeah, I can take a first stab at that. I think it's a good question to start with too, because cloud itself is just horribly vague. Cloud means different things to different people, and people have assumptions that if something is in the cloud, it has inherent security, it has inherent reliability, it has inherent disaster recovery. Anything cloud must be better than anything that's not cloud because it is the cloud, and that's not true. I think that a lot of companies have sort of banked upon the fact that the term cloud is vague and have sort of used it, to their own marketing benefits. And so I think it's very important that people, ask their vendors and get a clear understanding of, when you say you're offering me a cloud service, what does that actually mean? And how are you defining that? And what's included and what's not included? And so some examples of these bad assumptions, the one I like to give, and not to pick on Microsoft because I think it's a great product, is the Office 365 example. You move from traditional on-prem email servers, Exchange servers, to Office 365, and everything is going to be magically better. I'm paying per mailbox. I don't have to run my own servers. And, for the most part, that's true. And people assume that it's resilient and it has backups built in. So what it doesn't do is it does not have the backup capability built in. You cannot sort of log into Office 365 and restore a mailbox the way that it looked like a week ago or a month ago. And that's just, I think, one example of an assumption that people make around cloud services. And so, you got to ask those right questions.
Yeah, it's funny you said at the beginning that we always talk internally is that a lot of times the cloud is used as a marketing term as much as a technology term. Scott, what would you be able to answer and lend to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sagi hit the nail right on the head there. I can't tell you the number of executives and companies that I've communicated with over the years, and the most common misconception is that the cloud is more secure than if I were to manage the IT infrastructure on my own. And while that is correct to a degree, as Sagi kind of alluded to, it's not 100% entirely true. So there's different variations of cloud services. I mean, you have your private clouds, public clouds. You could have infrastructure as a service, software as a service, you name it. But depending on the different type of cloud environment that you're going to, there are going to be certain things that provider is going to be taking ownership of when it comes from a security perspective. I mean, physical access to the servers. I mean, people say, what is the cloud, right? So the cloud is just storage and computing power that is not on your computer system. It's hosted somewhere else, right? So that's exactly what's happening here is that cloud providers taking ownership of the disaster recovery controls, the physical access controls, the compute power, the storage capabilities, and the databases. Now, depending on the type of contract that you have with that cloud provider, they can tell you if you're getting those recovery controls in place, like disaster recovery controls, or maybe that's an additional feature or capability. But that's really about it. And we call it the cloud the shared cloud responsibility model, and there's a delineation point between what the cloud, the hosting provider is responsible for, and what you as the end customer, as the end consumer of the cloud service is responsible for. And
Right.
and when you boil it down, the main two things that you as a customer are responsible for, we see the most threats and risks and incidents when it comes to security, is identity and access management, or IAM, and how you as a customer handle the IAM features of that cloud service. And the second area is the actual data, the business data that's being saved and stored and processed inside that cloud environment. And you as a customer have the responsibilities of ensuring that the proper access controls are implemented around that area. So those are really that's the biggest misconception of what the cloud is.
Excellent, thank you for that. So let's flip it over to Dan now, because obviously, Dan, you're coming at it from a different perspective as a CIO of a credit union. You definitely see it from a different lens, right? How would you be able to say from the end user perspective to that question?
Well, everything comes back down to the skills and capabilities that you have in-house today and where your partner network extends. Is one particular more secure than another? Not necessarily. You can we're all in business, so we're going to have to accept a certain level of risk because we're in business. So it comes down to, what do you want to focus on? The risks are the risks. I mean, and there are no different risks per se in cloud versus on-prem, because they've already kind of been lined out there. It's what kind of countermeasure capabilities do you want to focus on in order to be able to enable your business to provide whatever types of services you want to provide. If you want to focus more on a data center, it's a different type of structure that you want to do, whether or not it be your own data center or co-location or in a cloud-like environment. I prefer a cloud-based environment mainly because I would not be able to recreate the automation capabilities that Microsoft or Amazon or Google have already built into it. So if I want to assume that no one of my systems lives longer than 72 hours, I can add an element of time that an attacker has to be able to defeat. Because every 72 hours, I'm going to rebuild from a gold image and be able to get my services back out there and back up and running. And so even if an attacker were to get their hooks in, they're going to have to reestablish them. And then hopefully that time element is going to allow my team or my partners to be able to catch them as they're reestablishing their hooks. Now, can I do that in an on-prem environment? Yes. It just means I need more people and more resources in order to be able to do that today. And so it just depends on what you're comfortable with and where your training is. So my preference is to be in a cloud environment that allows me to have that type of a model. And then I get all of these other services I can plug in, because I know that even if I have primarily most of my infrastructure in-house, I'm not going to get rid of other types of vendors that are out there. I'm not getting rid of a Salesforce. I'm not getting rid of an HR system. I'm not going to get rid of a payroll system. I'm going to have to be bringing them in. So as Scott alluded, how can I address the identity and access management piece to this? And I think the cloud framework, and as again, there's many different flavors of cloud, that framework as to how I'm going to implement it allows me a flexible architecture that I can bring components in and out, that I can have, and really I think it's a hybrid is really what most people are going with. It allows me that flexible and extensible architecture. I can have stuff on-prem, I can have stuff in a cloud, and I can provide services that are going to meet my employees' needs and my members' needs.
Excellent points. Thank you for that. So Dan and Sagi, I'm sorry, Sagi and Scott, I'm going to direct this more to you guys. Being that Webair and Cipher are on the provider side of this, let's say someone has an IT vendor, an MSP, an MSSP, who takes ownership of security for on-premise IT equipment. What should the expectations of those vendors and or providers be as it relates to cloud security?
Yeah, good question, Gerard. So I think I'll go ahead and kick this one off here. I think regardless of if it's an IT vendor, if it's your own IT team that's organic into your company, or an MSP or what has it that is traditionally used to taking ownership of the maintenance and the security of on-premise IT equipment, when you migrate to the cloud, there's certain things that you're gonna have to take into consideration, and a lot of these features were things that you as a provider, as a manager of these services, were used to being able to assess from a security perspective, but may no longer have that capability, or may need to be able to get that information from a different area or different telemetry. So for example, access to operating system logs and application logs. There's a lot of security relevant value in operating system logs and application logs that can be analyzed and evaluated for risk. When you migrate to the cloud, you're going to lose access initially to some of those different types of security relevant data. Depending on what type of cloud you migrate to, it may be easier or more difficult to regain access to that information, or that cloud service provider may have an additional service offering at an additional charge, which you will have to be able to engage with in order to collect that information. So for example, within AWS, this is the enablement of guard duty, for example. So I think when you look to migrate to the cloud, you want to take that into consideration ahead of time, or at least have that as part of the plan, is how am I going to begin to continue to assess the security of these devices inside the cloud. And one of the things that we at Cipher have done as part of our MDR service offering, Cipherbox, we've taken the collection of cloud-based logs into consideration so that when we work with our customers who have whether it's a fully migrated infrastructure in the cloud, or in most cases companies a hybrid where they have some level of access into the cloud and they still retain some level of IT infrastructure on-prem, that they're still able to get access to that telemetry to be able to evaluate for security risk.
Sagi, can you add to that as well?
Yeah, so I think you asked what the expectations end users should have of their IT vendors are as it relates to cloud. And I think there's, just like there's sort of misconceptions around cloud and what it means, the same exists for these IT vendors. A lot of organizations have an outsourced to an IT company. Maybe they could be called different things, and those terms are also ambiguous. You have MSPs, you have MSSPs, which are managed security service providers. You have hardware VARs, resellers. You have SIs, all sorts of different things. But ultimately, a lot of organizations are leaning on their IT company, and a lot of them assume that my IT company can handle everything related to IT. Now, IT, is so vast today that there is simply not one company that can be an expert in all of these different things. So you really have to identify who am I working with, and what are their areas of expertise, and how are those areas of expertise different as I'm going through my digital transformation. If I started using them 10 years ago because we needed to buy a lot of on-prem hardware, but today we're looking to use SaaS platforms. Is that vendor really the vendor to help me on that journey? And I think that the most important example of this is security. You know, you want to be careful not to consume all of your IT infrastructure and services through your partner. You want to have ownership of your accounts and services directly. And so regardless of if your IT partner is helping you set up on Salesforce or Office 365 or a cloud provider, or you're doing it yourself, make sure you own those accounts directly so that you can swap in and swap out your outsourced vendors without having to go back to them and getting into a fight about ownership. You know, this used to happen years ago when you know, someone would hire a web designer to design a little website, and then the designer rolls in the hosting, and now you want a new designer, you can't, because this company is controlling your website, or they own your domain. You know, yeah, it's the same thing, you know, with IT vendors for larger organizations. And again, the big example is security, and why? Because it's not really sort of ethical for a company to provide you with infrastructure services and to be the same company that tells you that those services are, you know, secure in an unbiased way. And that's why at Webair, you know, we provide a lot of managed cloud services. Do we build in security services? Sure. We manage firewalls. We take ownership of you know, access control lists and all sorts of different things. But the line stops there. Anything beyond that, we tell our customers, listen, you know, we do this much, but you want to ensure you're secure. You need a third party to hold us accountable and to tell you in an unbiased way that, like, hey, maybe Webair should change this or that. And that's why instead of like trying to become everything to everyone, we're more focused on ensuring that our services are compatible with any existing security vendor. Another reason why that's important is, let's say there's a large enterprise organization who's made a decision. We're going to bring in Cipher. Cipher is going to take ownership of our global security for all of our production systems. Now, the definition of production systems is changing. You know, production systems 10 years ago might have been, you know, the data center in Cleveland. Now, production systems is the data center there, you know, the hosted private cloud, colo, public cloud. And so, if that customer is, you know, housing important information on Webair, we can't tell them, don't worry, we got this. We have to make sure that they can drag along and bring along their existing security vendor, and that we're going to be compatible with it. And so I think that it's important for organizations to really understand what their IT partners are doing, and for some aspects of IT, like security, and maybe specialties like disaster recovery or software application development, you know, to focus on best in breed, and look for ones that are transparent about it and are not trying to pretend to do everything.
Yeah, so really, you actually
go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, you actually hit on a really good point. I think we were chatting about this the other day when you're talking about SaaS-based platforms, right? And you know, the example of the web hosting provider, I think, is really relevant, because most companies probably recognize that, you know, the marketing department's going to go out there and they're going to engage a web hosting provider. Sometimes that information may or not be pre-coordinated with the security team ahead of time. And I think that you know, during the pandemic, when we saw the rush for people to go to a work from home model, there's a misconception about cloud-based services, is that the IT team and the IT security team thinks that they're going to have a full understanding of every single piece of, you know, SaaS application and engagement that they've engaged with, and that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, we saw Zoom, Salesforce accounts, you know, Okta accounts being established, and some of those were coordinated on with the security department, and in some cases they weren't. So, you know, I think that the conception there as well is also to make sure that anybody in the organization that may be engaging into a cloud service provider, that they at least know that there is security is a stakeholder in here, and to at least make sure that, you know, that they're part of those conversations as the discussion is to migrate to those platforms.
Yeah, that's a great point. So Dan, I'm going to come your way now. You know, the lines of responsibility can get a little blurry when it comes to relationships between end users, vendors, and providers. So I'm sure our viewers can appreciate a little clarity on this as well. Can you tell our viewers more about the cloud shared responsibility model and where the boundaries of responsibility between the cloud provider and the organizations that use the cloud service would be?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question, because I actually don't believe the lines are very blurred at all. The risk, it falls on me as the CIO. It's my responsibility to accept the risk and to explain to my peers and to the board the level of risk that we are taking. And part of that comes down in understanding what the risk appetite of my organization is, and ensuring that with whatever providers I go with, that same level of risk is being applied continuously. And as it falls out of alignment with that I am working with my providers, my employees, to get it back to the level of risk we're willing to accept. Now, where I believe organizations start to get a little bit blurry is when we put out to certain partners as to this is what they're going to do and this is what my employees are going to do. We have to really, I treat my vendors, and hopefully they're partners, I treat them as an extension to my employees because they are performing a service on my behalf. And I am going to, in the event that we use an MSSP like Cipher, Cipher, what they are going to be responsible for. This is what they're going to do within their playbooks. We adjust our playbooks internally to utilize a company like this. So when we have certain things that occur, we know who's doing what and what type of reporting and escalation procedures are happening. The same thing when utilizing Webair. I know what Webair is providing and I know what my employees' responsibilities are. So those lines get blurred as it comes down to the actual execution of the tasks, so to speak, the execution of the operational activities. But where to me it's definitely not blurred is in who's responsible. And I'm responsible for maintaining the level of risk that Jovia, my CEO, and the board has been also willing to accept. And I report on that monthly. And we perform a number of different tasks with our partners on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually, and so forth. But really, I think the most important thing is when a CIO essentially, when they push that to a CISO or they push that to a partner, I think they're doing a disservice to themselves and they're doing a disservice to the organization, because the CIO has to play inside the lines, so to speak, because I have to understand the business risk, I have to understand the technology, I have to understand the security. And while my CISO has to be the expert, I have to know enough to be able to have those intelligent conversations, because a CISO is going to want to be on the extreme side of security, and my end users and members, they want more convenience. So I have to constantly be weighing those decisions to get the right balance of proper cybersecurity and maintaining the hygiene as well as delivering the service. So that's how I look at it, and thus far in my career it seems to work out pretty well.
Excellent points. Thank you for that, Dan. It's obviously critical that everyone involved knows who's responsible for what in these relationships. But Dan, also from my experience, I've noticed, and I don't think it's to any surprise for most people, that financial institutions in particular are a bit apprehensive when it comes to leveraging cloud solutions. Maybe you could shed some light onto what you see in that arena.
Well, financial institutions are in the risk business. We lend money, and we're not looking to lend money to those folks, whether it be a mortgage, a car loan, personal loans, lines of credit. We're not in the habit of giving out, and extending those lines of credit to members that aren't going to pay us back, right? So we're constantly looking in that risk business. So when we talk about any type of new services that come about, and while I would argue cloud really isn't all that new. I mean, it started off with application solution providers. US Internet Networking was one of the first back in the late 90s, and then they got gobbled up by AT&T. We just keep, as the Sagi said, we just basically keep rebranding it into something else until eventually someone says, oh yeah, that makes sense. So these things are new to them, and they're used to, like, financial services are used to, it's this way, this is the way we've always done it, this is the way we're going to continue to do it. But what changed when all these fintechs started popping up? When a Zelle, when the Cash Me apps, and all these fintechs started popping up, and they started kind of taking away from what the traditional financial services were bringing. You got Robinhood out there for investing. I no longer had to go as a consumer. I didn't have to go to my bank or credit union to get that service. So all of a sudden now these financial institutions, which are were brick and mortar, they were stable, and this is what us as a society trusted, because we knew they were always going to kind of be there. They didn't want to change. You would have operating systems in a financial services company called a core that might have been around for 30 years. And for those who don't know, Jovia wasn't one of those. We just recently did a core conversion, which we completed on June 1st. So to get us into that ability to be adaptable to what our membership needs are going to be. So, financial services companies, they didn't want to take on that risk because it wasn't known. They didn't want to take a chance. I mean, when you start, you're dealing with people's money. And so you start changing things and people don't have access to their money 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They get a little upset, and rightfully so. So financial institutions started to change because of fintechs entering the market. And when they started doing that, if we wanted to compete, we had to also take on a little bit more risk. We had to take some chances, but they're calculated risks. And this is why you have to have a good CIO, a good partnership network. So when you're making these decisions and you're taking on these calculated risks, that you've taken in all possible calculations that you can, and that you can quickly adapt in the event the risks aren't resulting to where you want. So that would be, when we start talking about residual risk. So if the residual risk isn't where we're comfortable, how are we going to change it?
Excellent. And Jovia has successfully leveraged cloud services. And as CIO, I'm sure there were challenges that you faced when you're working to implement cloud solution at Jovia. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the unique challenges that CIOs, CISOs face when it comes to cloud solutions? And are the regulatory requirements different when you're leveraging a certain cloud solution?
Well, the regulatory requirements, I think, are relatively the same across multiple industries. I mean, it's really does the company you're looking at, do they have their SOC 2, Type 2, and all these kind of things? But really,
right.
As you dig into that, hopefully the people that are reviewing those SOC 2s, they're actually asking some important questions. I mean, the frameworks that exist help guide us with a set of questions. But what I find is a lot of organizations just check a box. Oh, do they have the SOC 2? Yep. Did they read it? Well, it didn't ask me to read it. Well, come on. Like we're supposed to be relatively educated and professionals, and this has got to be more than a checkbox exercise. Because if it's just a checkbox exercise, guess what? You know what all these companies that have in common that have been breached recently? Whether it be Home Depot, Neiman Marcus, even Equifax, they were all compliant. They were all compliant at a particular point in time.
Box.
Right? if your cybersecurity is check a box, not do they have a SOC 2? Well, if they have it, they also mean, and it's implied, you should read it. And you should see what exceptions are in there. And if you're not comfortable with those exceptions, you need to get that provider to either make you feel comfortable or find a different provider. And I don't think a lot of them do that. I mean, this was the old thing, like myself kind of grew up in the industry. Hey, why did we go with Cisco? Well, because no one gets fired going with Cisco. Why did we go with Microsoft? Well, no one gets fired for going with Microsoft. But they are infrastructure and endpoint products. They're not security companies. They have some security offerings like Ziggy was talking about. They Webair, they manage to a certain point, and that's it. But Cisco and Microsoft and these other big vendors, they try to be everything to everyone. And therefore, what are you really? You're not a security company, you're not a provider, and they're a jack of all trades, master of none, and that only helps you to a certain extent. So, I kind of digress a little bit. Getting back to the question, the things that are challenging is that, one, where's my data? Where are my encryption keys? Because if I'm going to allow my encryption keys to be stored right next to the lock, it's like putting your home key and you put it under the mat. I mean, that's the first place we look as a crypt. Oh, is it under the mat? Is it on the windowsill? If it was a car, we pull down the visor, the keys drop out. That's what we see in the movies all the time. Well, it's the same thing with our encryption keys. If we're storing them right there, then it makes it easier for the bad actor to get there. So data, the encryption keys, and it's also a different model. We're used to, even if I look at, all right, I've engaged Jovia. Jovia has engaged Webair to perform some services for us. And I have to take into account what that service level agreement is and I have to manage to that expectations internally, because if we need a change done, whether it be in our virtual desktop environment or the virtual infrastructure that we've put in place there, I have to take that into account. So it's a shift of a mindset into how we're going to deliver those services. And is it better or worse? Not necessarily. I find that talent is really hard to come across. Great talent is even more difficult. And I think basically it's because Cipher and Webair has taken all the talent up in the area. Just saying it out there.
Hey Dan, I think you mentioned the encryption keys. I think that's really one of the best examples of this whole sort of compliance, box checking, and sort of issue with the audits and the reporting. And people will ask us the question, is the data encrypted? And right, like that's a requirement. Like HIPAA compliance says your data must be encrypted at rest and in transit. Okay, great. But it's one of those examples of how it's a false sense of security. The fact that your data is encrypted at rest, or it's sitting on a SAN with self-encrypting disks or something like that, it's only protecting against one tiny piece of the puzzle. It's protecting against physical security. If someone breaks into your facility and grabs that disk and grabs that SAN and steals it, yes, they cannot decrypt it. But how likely is that type of breach? It's extremely unlikely. I'd say 90% of the breaches that can potentially affect you, data encrypted at rest is not going to help you at all, because they're getting in via the applications, they're getting in via credentials, they're getting in via social engineering, and through all those avenues, that data is available already unencrypted. And so when we work with customers, and we work with a lot of hospitals and banks, and it's like you said, Dan, they're asking the wrong questions. Are you encrypting my data at rest? Are you encrypted? Yes, we do it. Like it's like that's like it's table stakes. People don't realize that you have to focus on the most common entry points and breaches. And honestly, those are it's the applications, it's the people. I could from our responsibility perspective, I could ensure the data center is resilient. You can't get into it. The servers are patched and all that. You just need one out-of-date application. People go, we see customers go on and install, open source modules that they just bolt onto their websites because they want a shiny little theme. Where do they come from? And is it still being maintained? And it kind of all goes back to these bad assumptions. Who's accountable to ensure the applications are up to date? Well, I thought it was the server folks. I thought it was the application folks. I thought it was my web designer. And so many of these issues can be mitigated by, listing out who is accountable and who is responsible for every single one of the layers of the onion. And unfortunately, people don't really start to ask those questions until after a breach occurs. And so we actually, when we engage with a new customer, we'll come right out and say it, and we'll say, here's a statement of work, which is actually legal language for a contract, and go ahead and redline it and mark it up just like your lawyers would, but mark it up from a technical perspective and go in and add stuff. Or we'll say, no, we can't do that. You need another company for that. So I'm sorry, but I think that encryption example is just spot on, because people are just not, they don't know those right questions to ask.
And they don't understand, as you said, like data at rest in encryption, basically it's only encrypted when it's turned off. Otherwise it's there, and I just have, now I got to rely on whatever type of maybe file-based encryption that might be there, but that's still not enough. I mean, I guess part of how I always looked at these things is growing up in a forensics world. So I look at it, and how I learned how to compromise systems was because I got to see what the crime scenes looked like. And you had to backwards engineer that to figure, oh, this is how they did it. And it's a false sense of security. Encryption, yeah, it's great, but I can't tell you how many times people are like, oh yeah, we have AES 256, but then they'll use an algorithm that essentially effectively only gives them 114 bits of encryption because they don't have the
back to what you said earlier, Dan. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's not the end all.
It's just a piece.
Right?
It's just a piece.
Right. So you can see our speakers here today are very passionate about this subject. That's why we're doing this webinar today. So
we can probably spend an entire hour just talking on
we can do hours on this.
So Scott, I'm going to turn to you. Obviously, based on this webinar, the reason we're even doing this is that cloud security is a huge concern, right? So what are some of the main considerations that an organization should keep in mind when it comes to cloud security? And can you give some examples of how organizations have been impacted by inadequate security in the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great transition off the conversation that Dan and Sagi just contributed to it. Sometimes the easiest way in is right through the front door. And, you know, I think the simplest, you know, the most successful ways that we've seen that an adversary is able to compromise a cloud environment, if I had to bucket them into three categories, they would be through weak IAM management, identity, credential, and access management. Number two would probably be insecure application programming interfaces, or APIs, that are connected between one environment and the other. And then three, which isn't anything new, it's system and application vulnerabilities. And vulnerability management has always been and will always continue to be a cornerstone for a good, mature security program. And if you're not doing it, and if your systems are not up to date with security, then you may have issues. So those are really the three areas that we see as being heavily exploited by threat actors. So, you know, when we talk about those areas, I mean, we talk about a couple different, you're asking for a couple different specific threats. You know, so one would be something that's called credential stuffing. And a credential stuffing attack is, let's take the premise that everyone has multiple applications that they log into. You could have dozens and dozens of applications, both for your professional life and as well as your personal life. And most applications either require a username as an email address, or as a username that you're probably using the same username for multiple different applications. And the credentials to log into those are probably going to be a username and password based, right? And that password is in most cases reused across multiple applications by a single individual. Now, let's say a third-party organization is breached, and what the threat actors do is they either take that information, those login credentials, there's different cryptographic methods in place to be able to crack those, so you can actually get the plain text username and password out of those, and they share that information either on the dark web, or they keep it themselves, and they use that information to then attempt to log in to other applications. And just by, you know, if you have a username and password credential for a bunch of different email accounts, you can try saying, okay, maybe let's try this in Office 365. It's publicly available. Right. I can go to, you know, Microsoft.com and go log in.
Start going down the line, right?
Exactly, and that's one of the ways in which you get in. And then to Dan's point, it doesn't matter what you have on the back end, if it's encrypted or not encrypted. You have valid credentials that have successfully authenticated to the environment to be able to do that. A small variation on this, though, too, is another attack technique called password spraying, which has been around for several years, right? And it's no secret.
Password spraying, is it?
Yeah, password spraying. So basically, it's just, I don't know what the password is, but I'm going to guess what the password is through user accounts. I'm going to take a user account, I'm going to keep guessing the password until it successfully logs you in, right? So, you know, these are simple things, but in reality, we see a lot of organizations that still fall victim to this. And one of the things that we would recommend is proper security hardening. And I really like CIS. It's called the Center for Internet Security. If you can think of any technology set that's out there, they have a manual and automated tools that are able to assess the environment and tell you specifically what you need to do to enable these settings to harden your environment to prevent against these things. So they touch on things like logging, identity and access management consideration, provisioning for elevated and root level accounts, certain specific security policies that should be enabled inside these cloud environments. The list goes on, but CIS security, the CIS benchmarks is definitely something that we usually recommend. And I'll finish on one thing here as well too, is you know, we've talked about identity and access management, everything, but another thing is just mistakes. Administrators accidentally expose databases to the internet. And we call these leaky databases, where once it's exposed accidentally to the internet, then anybody can see it at that point. And that comes down to one of the other areas that we talked about earlier about the shared cloud responsibility model, which is access control mechanisms around the data that's inside the environment.
Excellent, thank you, Scott.
I think you made a good point.
Turning to Sagi for a second here. I want to address this question towards you. If a company wants to migrate to the cloud, what steps can the IT department take to slowly migrate to the cloud and SaaS while maintaining its security? Like, which workloads do you recommend moving first, for example?
Well, I think on that topic, I mean, Scott mentioned IAM a few times, Information Access Manager. I think it's just I think you mentioned before that different departments can just go on and start consuming SaaS. And one of the areas where people get tripped up is it's just way too easy to just start using a platform and just tie it into your Office 365 authentication or your Gmail authentication. Like, we see it all as consumers when we sign up for new services, and we can just not sign up for an account and just plug it into our Facebook credentials or our Google credentials. As silly as it sounds, that's happening all day long with corporate environments, and different divisions are doing that and just attaching the authentication for these new SaaS platforms that they're using with controls and security that their IT teams have no idea about. So it's very important that the sort of the CISO or the IT security department has a handle on how authentication is being used sort of throughout the organization, and hopefully they're using some sort of centralized auth that ties into some multi-factor authentication, maybe something like Okta. I think that's par for the course. If you're going to go out and use SaaS, we don't want to have SaaS sprawl, which leads to IAM sprawl, and how do you deal with an employee leaving and all that sort of thing. But to answer your more specific question on workloads, and I think what I'm hearing is, how do we get from point A to point B, from, hey, all my infrastructure is on premises, I have a bunch of servers in my closet, I want to go to the cloud. I think today's panel probably made it even scarier. I don't think the idea was to make it a scarier proposition. It's just a lot of things to consider. But I think what's important is, it doesn't have to be a black and white sort of transition. It's not all my servers are in my closet or they're all in a public cloud tens of thousands of miles away. There's this concept of hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, and the idea is that there's this really beautiful gray area where, if you already have some established guidelines for your organization's security and already established guidelines for what your network looks like, and when I say network, I mean how users are interconnected back. Maybe it's SD-WAN, and maybe it's MPLS, maybe it's VPN. You've sort of you have a framework, and now you want to go and consume cloud. Typically that breaks the mold. We have to go and get an exception from our CISO because we're going to use this cloud service or SaaS or whatever. So one of the things that we've done to mitigate that at Webair is provide something that's in between. And the way that we do that is by physically connecting our customers' IT organization to a Webair data center that's close to them in their backyard. We do that by, let's say, ordering a 10 gig circuit to their office, or tying into their existing MPLS network or their existing SD-WAN. Basically, we want to be a tenant on their network, and we want to provide cloud services that conform to their already existing built frameworks. So we're just like another office on their campus, and we can give them cloud inside their network. And it can be air-gapped from the public internet. It's going to be the same technology that they're used to, maybe VMware or Hyper-V. It's going to be the same IP address. It's going to be low latency, and it's going to be sovereign. And that's one example of how we can sort of give you the best of both worlds, between infrastructure that was on-prem, where it's obviously secure and it's low latency and it's fast, but you also want to outsource and use a vendor to take ownership and accountability for managing the hardware, the software, for backing it up, doing DR and all those things. So, for people out there that think, well, I can't use cloud because X, Y, and Z, for every one of those buts or exceptions that I've heard from a CISO or a CIO, it's like, well, we can work around that through flexibility and customization. Now, not all vendors might have an appetite to customize or be flexible that way, and Webair has chosen to do so. We're not. It's not about having an industrialized cookie cutter product, because we know that there's a lot of enterprise customers that have, a very complex environment with lots of legacy platforms. So we want to, conform to that. So I'd say that's like one example of, yes, you can use cloud, even though you think you might not be able to. Yes, there's ways to mitigate these risks. Last comment I'll make on SaaS is that before you go and decide to use any cloud or SaaS product out there, don't go run and click the button. Does it conform to our standards for security and compliance? And let's say as an organization, I'm using Cipher as in my MSSP. If I'm going to go out and use a SaaS, can they? And I'm holding them accountable to ensure my security. Can they go and monitor that platform? If I go tomorrow and start using Salesforce, is there a hook in that they can monitor? And people might say, well, it's just this little SaaS product, but before you know it, it's now hooked into your backend system, and it has critical information. So anything that's out there that's hosting an organization's critical information has to be protected, has to be blanket protection across the organization. And so check with your security vendors; they can actually protect that and monitor that.
Right. So yeah, I would say it's not scary or not scary. Like the point is in making sure that security is front and center, right? So, and that's really the point of this webinar too, so that we're thinking about that as we move forward. So, but another thing that we're all
the same thing.
To address this to everyone on the panel here, and Dan, you could take it first. COVID-19 is on everyone's mind, of course. Many companies are shifting to remote workforces, whether permanently, partially. We have people out in the remote workforce now. With the majority of those workforces working from home, what do companies need to do to ensure proper security of the environment and that stays in place? Because you might have had that initially, but now the workforce has changed, right?
Well, certainly it's changed. But before that, I thought I heard Sagi said he recommended Hyper-V. Did I hear that correctly?
No, what I said was, I said whatever you're already bought into, whatever your point is, whatever your Kool-Aid is. I said I wasn't going to pick on Microsoft at the beginning.
Yeah. So.
And so Dan, we're just talking more COVID-19 now, and the remote workforces. How does that factor into?
Yeah. So
especially
it factors in quite a bit. Organizations were put into a position they've likely never been put into, at least if they've worked here in the United States. And I can tell you from Jovia's perspective, we were not traditionally a work remote environment. Everyone was physically in an office, and this is the way in which we did things. Thankfully, we were able to quickly adapt. And do so in a different environment than what most companies would have gone through. In terms of what they were used to. I mean, those companies that have already employed, laptops and a work from home, I would say they may have actually been in a more difficult position in handling the security, because now those laptops are never always on the network, and so they miss the patching schedule, they miss their endpoint updates because they're used to coming in and it gets it done when they're on the corporate network, and they never implemented it from a remote access capability. So I took, in essence, a first principles design thinking is, if I'm going to develop a remote access strategy, how am I going to do this from the very beginning? And how can I do so in a way in which it's going to be cost effective and provide my employees with a service that they'll be able to do. And this started because we were, as I had mentioned earlier, we're going through a core conversion, and I was worried about a snowstorm hitting us and delaying this core conversion. So we started testing Chromebooks with VPN access, with multi-factor authentication in order to get in via VPN, and then just remote desktop, which is a very crude way of doing things, but it gets the job done. But no one had ever really had remote access. We had people with iPads and phones, but which allows them to consume data, but they're really not creating data off of an iPad. And I don't consider email as being creation of data. They're not creating content. They're not creating Word documents off their iPad. I mean, if they are, kudos to you, because I certainly can't do it. I mean, nothing to any extent.
I don't have the attention span for that.
Yeah, it would probably, it would not feel good. So we implemented these Chromebooks, and then COVID happened. Now, thankfully, I already had something, and I already had a vision as to where I was going. And it was easy to grab Chromebooks off the shelf. Now, so we got a bunch of Chromebooks. We started down a multi-pronged approach, which we were entertaining virtual desktop infrastructure. We called, Webair, which, Webair was able to quickly stand us up an environment that we were able to go back in, and we could get people working as well as Citrix to replace the remote desktop. We were able to deploy additional functionality through our mobile device management platform to manage personal devices, to ensure that as a personal device that may have Citrix or a VDI client, that they at least are up to date and are conforming to our security policy before they would get in. And COVID to me was a blessing, because it launched us into a capability to be able to deliver services to all of our members from wherever our employees happen to be. I mean, and I'm hoping we're going to continue to extend upon the delivery of those services. I did some other things, and some people might consider me somewhat of an evil person when it comes to this, because I think like the attacker. So the first thing I started doing was start phishing tests on all of my remote employees, specifically to them. And not so much that I know we're going to catch people. That's not my goal in phishing. My goal is my notification rate, the people that got what looks like a phishing attempt, is that higher than the people who may have clicked on it? Because I'll tell you, I'm not a huge fan of phishing in general, because we send out so many emails that are legitimate emails that look like phishing, and our phishing emails therefore look like legitimate. So I'm looking for, are they reporting? And I got to tell you, I'm happy that the amount of people that reported in, hey, this looks suspicious. So we tried those things. We started giving them training on how to just work more in a remote environment, because while we had some Office 365 things out there, no one was really using it. So how do we get that communication out to people? Communication in any type of event, and this event has been going on since basically the beginning of March. How often are we communicating with employees? How are we making sure they're feeling secure? How are we getting them their updates? How are we getting them the training that they need? And I feel like Jovia has done quite exceptional when everything in the world for us was changing, because we were also went through a core conversion in the middle of this. So that's the most difficult thing that any financial institution can do, is go through a core conversion. And Jovia did that in the middle of a pandemic and remote. So we had every obstacle against us, and we were able to do it. So
all right. That's some great points. I want to get to the Q&A section here, but before we do, Scott, I want to give you an opportunity just to give me a quick response to the COVID-19 question.
Yeah, thanks, George. So I mean, Dan hit the nail on the head, right? It was a shift to work from home, and it was a shift to protect the endpoint. So he touched on EDR, touched on patch management, he touched on employee awareness and training of social engineering threats. Absolutely, that's absolutely necessary in today's environment. I think one of the things, just to kind of be quick here, I know we want to get to Q&A. We as a service provider, Cipher, go to vendors and say, okay, how can we get the best deal possible so that we can offer it as a service to companies? And ever since the pandemic hit, a lot of companies are looking at flexibility in pricing, and not being able to forecast out 3 to 6 months down the road, and they need a flexible model. So we as a service provider have gone back to the vendors and said, okay, look, the traditional 1 year, 3 year approach may not necessarily be the most appropriate for right now. What can we do about it? And luckily, with some of the vendors that were out there, they're willing to change their pricing models. And we're happy to say that we've engaged with a couple of endpoint providers to be able to add a flexible pricing model that we can extend to our customers. That not only can we increase, but we can decrease, and that's the biggest thing as well too, is decreasing. If you don't need as many licenses, because unfortunately you may not have as many employees as, for the next couple of months, you need to be able to grow and shrink your security needs as necessary. So I just want to kind of highlight that we're looking at being aggressive in that regard as well too for pricing.
Thanks, Scott. We do have a few questions here, so let's go into the Q&A section from our viewers here. Let's see, the first question I have is from Tracy Kovacevic. Do you contractually lay out the responsibilities for each party through security SLAs? Sagi, I think that could be a good one for you to address.
Yeah, so a good question. We list out the responsibilities contractually, and sometimes this will be called a RACI matrix or responsibility matrix, where we want to be absolutely clear where our customers know where the line is drawn for what we are accountable for and responsible for, and what the customer is responsible for. And is it covered by an SLA? Yes, it is covered by SLA. And are there contractual remedies to deal with sort of failure to meet SLA? Yes. And is there sort of cybersecurity insurance to cover breaches? Yes, that's all there. And you know, it needs to be there when, you know, we're dealing with compliance type of information like EMR. And not all vendors or companies, you know, it's sort of thing where like a service provider like Webair or Cipher, you know, we're not going to like go out and just advertise it. And it's there if you look at the contract, but you have to ask the right questions, and you can't just have the lawyers redline the contract. Like I said, it's got to be a technical review too.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question here. This one is from Rafael in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Is there a simple fix that we can perform immediately? So basically, so the user can leave this webinar today and within 5 minutes be a little bit more secure than they were before the start of this webinar. And I think that's probably good for Scott and Dan to address.
Yeah, I mean, I'll wrap it up real quick. I think the easiest bang for your buck when it comes for return on investment and time and effort is vulnerability management, and you know, being able to continuously on a periodic basis assess all of your applications and all your software for vulnerabilities, and addressing those vulnerabilities is probably the most important, especially now since there's certain challenges in place with, you know, employees working from home, and, you know, being able to actively look at those you know, those endpoints at the you know, that may no longer be traditionally connected to the corporate environment, and making sure that you're still maintaining a proper patch management program in place.
So to me, the thing that anyone can go away and right now, you know, be more secure than what they were, is to go to the website, have I been pwned, put in your email addresses and sign up for it. And it's going to tell you if that email address, because that's what we use a lot of times for our account identification, has been compromised and through which compromise it occurred. And then with that, download a password manager or implement multi-factor authentication, because as an end user, you know, it's been a little while since I've looked at any of the studies, but at one point in time, the average consumer had to maintain 28 passwords, but they only had 8. So they were reusing them. So if you implement a password manager, you know, it's going to get out there. It's going to make it more difficult. One, you just have to remember your password to the password manager, and then sign up for, you know, the Have I Been Pwned or a service like that. So when your email address and password shows up in the next compromise, you know exactly where to go to update your password.
That's excellent. Thank you, Dan. Why don't you take the next question? We have one more here that says, very straightforward. What's the most secure device out there today?
The one I'm currently not trying to get into. You know, we're all in the business of risk, right? So if you're going to have to use a device, then it's the one that you're going to be maintaining. Like, you know, there's plenty of people out there that love an iPhone. I'm not one of them. I prefer Android, but, you know, I was the CISO for a company that we were building an Android phone, and my doctoral research happened to be in mobile security. So there's a lot more things that I did with that. But I will tell you, if you're using an iPhone or an Android phone, keep it up to date, because on almost all those updates, it's security patches. And those security patches are because there are bad actors out there that are trying to compromise these devices. If you're using an Android phone, by all means, only get your particular applications from Google Play. Don't allow untrusted third-party access to that, and go to these other alternative app stores. Those are when you hear these things, all this malware in Android is because they're all in these third-party app stores for the most part. But just keep your device up to date. If I were going to be recommending someone that was really worried about a secure device outside of a phone, I would be telling them to get a Chromebook, because today it's security through obscurity. The bad actors just aren't focusing on it because it doesn't have enough of a market share. But I also happen to like the Chromebook, and actually, because most people aren't going to be able to go out and use a particular Linux on their laptop and stuff like that. But love the Chromebook. But whatever device you use, don't skip those patch updates. When it comes up and it says you have a patch, would you like to install? Yes, install it, because there's likely security patches that are in there. So just do it. Do it on a regular basis, please.
Good points. Good points. I have one more question here. This one is from John Harrington. It says, what is your opinion of OWASP top 10 and how do they relate to cloud environments? I think, Scott, maybe you're best for that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think OWASP, that's a great question. So I mean, OWASP top 10 is definitely a it's a good framework for what are the top 10 application vulnerabilities that are out there. I would say, you know, in order to get access into a web environment, you're going to have to interact with an application. So looking at, you know, the injection attack techniques that are out there, authentication and how it could potentially be broken, looking at access controls, there's a specific list of top 10 you know, vulnerabilities associated with these applications. Review it, look at it, and check with your cloud service provider to see how each one of those are mitigated and through what method are they mitigated.
Thank you, Scott. All right, everyone, that's about it. That sums up our webinar here, our time here today, but I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. Really do appreciate that. Great thank you to go out to our speaker, Scott, Sagi, Dan, for sharing your expertise in cloud security with us. If we didn't get to your question here, please feel free to reach out to us directly. You can send a direct email to webinars@webair.com. Let us know your question, who you want it addressed to, and we'll make sure we get that answer to you. Again, thank you, everyone, and please be safe.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.